When everything in our Austin home is going smoothly, it seems like there's no reason to change anything. The stability Daniel and I have carefully built over the years has become more than just a cozy refuge. It's like a familiar melody played endlessly, again and again. Everything seems fine, maybe even perfect. We live in a rhythm where every day is predictable, like the tick of a clock. Work, dinner, talks about daily matters, TV shows. Perhaps it all suited me, but deep down, something remained unfulfilled. Maybe it was a call for new experiences or the feeling that I lacked the kind of emotions that spark light in the eyes. One evening at dinner, as if he had read my thoughts, Daniel suddenly said, "How about taking a trip to New Orleans this weekend?" I almost dropped my fork, looking at him in surprise. Travel had never been his priority. He's more of a homebody who prefers the safety of familiar surroundings. And it was all the more surprising that he was now suggesting a trip I had tried to convince him to take myself. But the strangest part wasn't even that. Daniel clarified that he intended to mend his relationship with his older brother, Ethan, whom he hadn't spoken to in years. Hearing this from Daniel was even more surprising, as Ethan had always been something of a ghost from the past, one he rarely mentioned and spoke of reluctantly. "New Orleans?" I repeated, still a bit skeptical, trying to understand what had prompted him to such an idea. "With your brother?" Daniel tilted his head slightly and, avoiding my gaze, said, "Yes, I think it's time to fix old mistakes. Ethan and I haven't seen each other for too long. Maybe this will be a new beginning for us since he hesitated, and for a moment I saw a glimmer of anxiety in his eyes. Perhaps that's when I felt a spark. It had been a long time since I'd seen such a desire in him to move forward toward something uncertain yet mesmerizing. I readily agreed, sincerely hoping that the journey would help Daniel reconnect with his brother and add the diversity I'd been craving. It felt like a breath of fresh air, an opening of doors to something new, possibly even risky, but not alone, with him. Before the trip, I walked thoughtfully through my closet, choosing what to pack. Strangely enough, there was that very anticipation even in the little things, as if something important was about to happen. New Orleans had almost become a dream for me, a city where history intertwines with every corner, where legends come alive. I hoped that this special city would remind us of how to be close to each other. We left early in the morning, with the city still shrouded in twilight. Daniel was silent the whole way, focused on the road and his thoughts, which was unusual for him. We usually talk during trips, discussing our plans for the day, but today he seemed absorbed in something else, something that didn't require words. When we arrived at an old hotel in the center of New Orleans, I was certain the trip would be a new experience for us. Our arrival in New Orleans was almost surreal, as if time and space had shifted. The streets, filled with the hum of life, carried that feeling of freedom and magic that is so rare to find in daily life. Daniel walked confidently along the sidewalk, sure of his purpose, while I allowed myself to take in every corner of this city, hoping that this journey would breathe new life into our relationship. We headed to an old restaurant in the center, where, according to Daniel, Ethan was supposed to be waiting for us. I had no idea what to expect from him, and to be honest, I felt a bit wary. Daniel and Ethan had never spoken about their estrangement, and I always felt that it was a forbidden subject. Perhaps it was this unknown that made the anticipation of the meeting even sharper. When we entered, my attention was immediately drawn to a man at the bar, deeply immersed in conversation with the bartender. Ethan. He looked both like and unlike my husband. It was as if he had absorbed all the genuine ease that Daniel seemed to lack. Tall, with a confident posture, dressed a bit roughly, but there was a certain charm in that. His eyes, a warm shade of brown, were not just expressive. They seemed to read people from the first encounter. Ethan turned and saw us, standing up immediately with a smile as easy as that of an old friend we'd known our whole lives. "Daniel!" His voice was deep, filling the room. They exchanged a quick embrace, and Ethan stepped back slightly, turning his gaze to me. "And you must be Emily. Nice to meet you." I smiled in return, but the moment our eyes met, I felt a slight unease. There was a glimmer of interest in his gaze, almost imperceptible, but noticeable enough for me to catch it. Ethan seemed more relaxed and open than I had expected, and there was an inexplicable warmth in his interactions with both of us. His confidence and simplicity instantly created an atmosphere in which I felt comfortable and pleased. At some point, Daniel seemed to become a bit distant, or so it seemed. Casually, he announced that he had a meeting with an old friend. This struck me as odd since we had just arrived. I nodded without asking questions, and within a few minutes he said goodbye, promising to return for dinner. Ethan and I were left alone, and a silence hung between us that for some reason didn't feel awkward. He looked at me as if he knew all my doubts, smiling gently. "Looks like we have time to explore the city a bit," he suggested. "Want to take a walk? I'll show you the real New Orleans, the part hidden from tourists' eyes." I wanted to decline out of politeness, but curiosity got the better of me. I agreed, and we headed to one of the narrow streets that hid behind the bustling French Quarter. Walking with Ethan turned out to be nothing like what I had expected. He wasn't just open and talkative, but easily joked and immersed himself in stories about the city with such passion that I couldn't pull away from his words. Every street, every corner held a special meaning for him. He told stories about his childhood, about adventures he had experienced here, and about what this city meant to him. His words carried a certain lightness and sincerity that I rarely encountered. It was as if he lived not by rules but by some inner compass that led him to freedom and life's pleasures. I couldn't help but feel admiration for his energy and outlook on life. We stopped by a street artist painting portraits of passers-by. Ethan suggested getting our portrait done, and although the idea seemed a bit absurd at first, I agreed without thinking. While the artist worked, Ethan chatted with me about art and life, and I began to feel that there was more to our conversation than just an exchange of words. He listened attentively, didn't interrupt, and encouraged me to share more when I mentioned my hobbies. When our portrait was ready, I looked at it with a smile. It came out rather funny, but I strangely wanted to keep it. At that moment, I caught myself feeling comforted by his presence, as if this moment had been long awaited, though unconsciously so. Returning to the main streets of the city with its noise and clamor, I began to realize that in Ethan's warm gaze there might be something more than simple brotherly affection toward his brother's wife. This sudden impulse made me tense for a moment, but I immediately brushed the thought aside, chalking it up to my own imagination and the impression of our first day in this magical city. We returned to the hotel where Daniel was already waiting. I said goodbye to Ethan, feeling slightly confused by everything, and headed to our room. New Orleans came to life at night, transforming before my eyes like a character shedding its daytime mask. We walked through the streets, illuminated by antique lanterns, lost in conversation. His voice, velvety and deep, blended with the distant rhythm of jazz music seeping out of nearby bars. I found myself completely forgetting about time, as each of his stories seemed to pull me into a parallel reality. "Did you know that when I was around 16, my friends and I nearly ended up in jail here?" He chuckled, recalling something both dangerous and thrilling. "What did you do?" I laughed, intrigued by his openness. Ethan immersed himself in the memory, telling me how they'd climbed to the roof of a historic church to watch the sunset from the best spot in the city. The police caught them in the act, but luckily they got away with just a warning. His words flowed freely, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to share his memories with me. Every episode of his life, every moment he described seemed to bring us closer. He spoke about his love for art, for nighttime walks, about the places that felt like home to him, all so alive that I couldn't help but feel captivated by his world. We stopped near an old building covered in ivy, and at some point we found ourselves at a small cafe tucked away on a side street, hidden from the main road. Its dim lighting created an atmosphere as if we'd found a haven from the world. Ethan looked at me, and there was something in his gaze I couldn't explain. He moved closer, and in his eyes I caught a glimpse of something that made me tense, though I didn't back away. It felt as if he wanted to say something important, something beyond amusing stories about his past. "Emily," he began somewhat hesitantly. "You know, it feels strange to admit this, but this attraction, it's not new. I felt it for you a long time ago. Even when we'd only met once or twice, it was there, and it hasn't faded. Even after all these years." His words made me freeze. In the silence between us hung an invisible thread, and I could feel something stirring within me that was beyond my control. His confession sounded so open, so bold, that I wanted to dive into this whirlpool of feelings, but something still held me back. I swallowed nervously, unsure of how to respond. But part of me had already made a decision without words, as though my body had answered before I could think it through. I took a step toward him, almost imperceptible, but he caught the movement. We both leaned closer, and that step wasn't just a movement. It was a decision I had perhaps been on the path to for a long time. Before I realized what I was doing, he leaned in and our lips touched. The kiss was fleeting, almost gentle, like a touch that warms only for a moment but leaves a lasting trace. This moment changed something within me, stirring up long-dormant emotions and raising countless questions. Ethan quickly pulled back, a flicker of embarrassment mixed with the same attraction I felt myself. He didn't say anything, and I too seemed to have lost my words. The sensation of his closeness, of that brief touch that held something forbidden and exciting, made me remember something I hadn't felt in my marriage in a long time. It wasn't just a physical impulse, but something more, something I couldn't simply turn away from. We both walked back to the hotel in silence, and in my mind, thoughts and doubts intertwined in a whirlwind. When we returned to the hotel, I immediately felt myself slipping back into the invisible mask of the familiar, reliable person I'd become over the years with Daniel. I had only a few minutes to compose myself, gather my thoughts, and steady my breathing before walking into the room and facing him. Inside, that moment, that kiss, still resonated, a memory that lingered like a quiet but unrelenting melody. I hoped Daniel wouldn't notice, though oddly enough, a feeling of guilt began to seep through that mask. He was sitting on the bed, staring at his phone when I entered. His gaze slid over me, and for a moment it seemed as if he could see everything. The worry, the turmoil, all those emotions that had yet to find release. But he just smiled, and I felt relieved, though I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hint of suspicion in his eyes. "How was your walk with Ethan?" he asked, not looking away. "It was great," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady and casual. "He showed me the city, told me many interesting things." I sat down beside him, pretending to be absorbed in the thought of taking off my shoes, but really, I was only thinking about what I was hiding from him more than he would ever know. And no matter what I did, thoughts of Ethan kept returning, resurfacing again and again. His words, his gaze that seemed to see right through me, all of it lingered, filling every pause. Had I really drifted so far from Daniel? Ethan seemed to have exposed a wound I hadn't noticed, but that had been there all along. I missed the ease with which he communicated, his ability to openly share his thoughts, hiding neither words nor feelings. I realized that in our marriage there had always been something unspoken, something we had chosen to avoid. We'd been together for years, yet his feelings and thoughts, as if locked behind strong walls, remained a mysterious, unreachable world to me. Unlike Ethan, Daniel lived strictly by his principles and routine, and maybe that was part of what had initially attracted me to him. "Are you tired?" he suddenly asked, leaning his head slightly towards me, as if trying to see something deeper in my face. I nodded, hoping to assure him that everything was fine, but the words came with difficulty. I didn't want to lie, didn't want to hide my thoughts, but I knew it was the only way to keep the peace. "Yes, the walk was long. New Orleans is too beautiful not to spend hours exploring it," I replied with a light smile, hoping this would explain both my wandering gaze and my pensiveness. As well as any shadow that might have reflected on my face, Daniel seemed to accept the explanation. He took my hand. His touch was warm, but somehow distant. Perhaps it had always been like this. But now I felt it more acutely. The comparison came to me unbidden, and it hurt. This touch lacked the passion, the genuine, untamed closeness I had felt today, but which I was afraid to acknowledge. We went to bed, but while Daniel fell asleep, I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, desperately trying to quiet the whirlwind of thoughts. Why Ethan? Why did he awaken these feelings that I had long buried? The answers remained unclear, but one kept circling in my mind. Maybe it was because he offered me something I had always been missing. Emotions that didn't need to be suppressed. Words that could hold sincere meaning. Evening enveloped New Orleans in a soft violet dusk when I received a message from Ethan. The phone screen glowed with simple words. "How about a quiet drink? There's something to talk about." My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a warmth spreading through my chest, mixed with a sense of secrecy and forbidden allure. These few words made me think more than I should allow myself, and one question kept circling in my mind. Why couldn't I just let go of this moment? I glanced at Daniel, who was sitting in the corner of the room engrossed in his laptop. He was near, yet somehow distant, immersed in his own world, one to which I no longer had access. Inside me, doubts clashed. To go or to stay, to forget about this evening and return to familiar stability. But something kept pulling me toward where Ethan was, and I couldn't shake the thought that this meeting was necessary for finding answers to the questions tormenting me. Half an hour later, I arrived at Ethan's apartment. He opened the door, meeting me with a quiet smile. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt a sense of calm and ease I'd been missing. There was nothing familiar here, only the warm glow of lamps and soft jazz playing in the corner, creating an atmosphere of intimacy. Ethan poured us each a glass of wine, and we settled on the couch. The first sip warmed me, and I felt the tension start to slip away. We talked for a long time, and I, as if forgetting my own restrictions, shared with him what had been troubling me. It was like a flood of words breaking through barriers I'd built over years of marriage. "You know, Ethan," I said, lowering my gaze, "sometimes I feel like our relationship with Daniel has just stopped. We live together. We have stability. But so often I miss real closeness. The kind where you don't have to hide your thoughts, suppress your feelings." I looked at Ethan, not expecting any particular response, but his reaction surprised me. In his gaze there was not only support, but also something more, a kind of understanding I had long been yearning for. He listened without interrupting, with a profound warmth that made me feel both vulnerable and protected. "Emily," he said softly, moving a bit closer, "you deserve to be heard, to be yourself, not to hide. Sometimes life pushes us to the edge so we can find what we're truly seeking." His words wrapped around my heart like delicate threads, filling it with warmth. Maybe I understood this myself, but admitting it to myself had been much harder. Silence hung between us, and I felt my heartbeat quicken. Every glance, every movement seemed intentional. I should have left, but inside, something had already been decided. Ethan placed his hand on my shoulder, and the touch was so light yet palpable that I held my breath. He didn't say anything more, didn't push, didn't hurry, just looked at me, and in that gaze was permission to be myself, to release all the doubts and restraints. We found ourselves closer than we had realized. Feeling his warmth so close, I understood just how much I had been missing it. A voice within urged me to stop, but all my thoughts dissolved in his presence. Almost giving in to an inner impulse, I let go of my guilt and allowed myself to feel this new emotion, experiencing for the first time a freedom from all obligations and restraints. That night, we crossed a boundary I had long guarded, and something within me changed. This night seemed to erase the boundaries between who I had been and who I perhaps always wanted to be. I felt every touch, every look from Ethan as if revealing a hidden, unknown side of myself. His hands, both strong and gentle, seemed to pull me toward freedom, and in every movement, every moment, there was sincerity and pure passion. Never before had I felt so wanted, so real as I did at that moment. Memories of our closeness washed over me like waves, so deep and intense that they took my breath away, as if the world around us had ceased to exist. We both knew it was wrong, but in that secluded corner of the apartment, hidden from prying eyes, only we and this moment existed, binding us together. No words, no promises could capture the range of emotions I experienced. That night, immersed in his embrace, I realized how, day by day, year by year, I had suppressed my desire to be heard, to be authentic. When the first rays of morning light filled the room, reality returned to my consciousness like a mist lifting. I lay beside him, enveloped in a strange blend of happiness and the dawning realization of what had happened. Something within me had shifted, as if an essential part of my being, long silenced, had finally awakened. Ethan kissed me goodbye without a word, and I quietly got dressed and left his apartment, feeling the weight of returning to the real world with each step. I couldn't let myself relax, knowing that I would now face this feeling again and again, hiding it from Daniel. Each step back carried with it the trace of a new truth for me, though I couldn't say it aloud. When I returned home, Daniel was still asleep. His peaceful face, so familiar and dear, suddenly evoked a sharp pang of guilt and sadness. I looked at him, and memories of how we met, how he courted me, how we built a life full of reliability and mutual support floated before my eyes. But at the same time, I realized that it had been a long time since I had felt that spark that had flared so easily beside Ethan. Perhaps it wasn't his fault. Perhaps we had simply stopped noticing each other amidst the routine of long years. I slipped quietly into the shower, hoping to wash away the night's memories as if they were just water on my skin. But something inside kept reminding me of what had happened. The emotions didn't fade, and as I washed my face, I understood that my inner state had changed. This wasn't just a romantic impulse or a surge of passion. It was something deeper that I had long suppressed, pretending that the stability our marriage offered was enough. The whole day passed in a strange daze. Daniel, unaware of what had transpired, returned to his routines, while I seemed trapped between what I knew and what I had discovered in one night. We talked as usual about work, about weekend plans, but in his words I sensed something distant, as if the space between us had become tangible, almost palpable. Now I faced a question. What to do next? Returning to life with Daniel, I tried to behave as if nothing had changed, as if the memories of Ethan's touch didn't haunt me every day. I did everything I usually did, made breakfast, we talked about routine plans, went on walks once a week. But in the back of my mind, behind the mask of our usual life, thoughts of that night remained stubbornly lodged in place. The images, more like impressions than memories, had transformed into shadows I could see every day. Every time Daniel and I were together, something inside told me he had noticed my distance. It felt as though we spoke only on the surface, avoiding the depths that I had briefly glimpsed within myself. I would catch his looks, filled with silent questions, and I knew he sensed the divide between us, but was perhaps afraid to acknowledge the real reason. One evening, as I was putting away clothes in the closet, he came over quietly and placed his hand on my shoulder. His touch was warm and soft as always, but I sensed a weight in it, an unspoken desire to awaken us both from our silence. "Emily," he began, his voice almost apologetic. "I feel like we've grown distant lately. You seem to be lost in your thoughts. Maybe we could spend an evening together. Have dinner, just talk?" His words caught me off guard. There was a genuine attempt in his voice to reconnect, to restore the lightness that had once existed between us. I agreed, of course, but deep down, I felt a growing conflict, as though this offer, though well-meaning, had come too late. We had lost something important, and I could no longer imagine how to recover it. At dinner, in a cozy restaurant, Daniel ordered our favorite wine and reached out to hold my hand as he used to many years ago. We sat at a table surrounded by soft music and the quiet murmur of other guests. But that invisible wall between us remained, the one I could feel more and more sharply. It seemed like we were talking about everything: work, plans, even the old jokes that used to make us laugh. But it felt as though each of us was in a separate room. He probably hoped for an open conversation, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. My heart felt heavy with fear and guilt, not just for hiding the truth, but for the internal resistance I felt to even try. It was as if every attempt to get closer only made it clearer that my soul was drawn in another direction, toward that moment of freedom and passion I had felt with Ethan. Daniel seemed to notice my tension. He withdrew his hand, looking away thoughtfully, and I saw the same sadness in his eyes that I had once felt myself. In that moment, I wanted to take his hand, to tell him I was still here, that I was still his wife. But I knew it would be a lie, and the realization stung painfully. I had never before been so caught up in a battle with my own thoughts. Alone, I tried to piece everything together, like scattered pages of a book that refused to come together into a whole story. Guilt, doubts, and an involuntary longing pulled me in different directions, each voice demanding attention and an answer, yet none providing a final solution. I knew that my relationship with Ethan couldn't continue, that it was a fleeting moment that had come and gone. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to move forward. Each time I thought of that night, a warm wave of joy washed over me, so vivid and unfamiliar that I wanted to return to it, forgetting everything else. But right behind that wave rose a weighty sense of guilt, and it became hard to breathe, understanding how this betrayal could shatter everything Daniel and I had built. And yet the thought that going back to my old life no longer seemed possible grew stronger and stronger. Daniel began noticing my distance more than ever. His gaze, intent and searching, seemed to seek answers I couldn't give. He suggested we spend an evening together, have a quiet dinner, and remember the early days when everything between us was simpler and brighter. I couldn't refuse, feeling that I, too, needed this evening, perhaps as a kind of farewell to something that could no longer be reclaimed. We chose a restaurant where we had once had our first date. It hadn't changed. The same dim lights, the same scent of fresh bread, and the same table by the window where we'd spent the night sharing our dreams. At some point, I felt an indescribable longing for those days when we were just starting out. Everything had felt so easy, like a breath of fresh air. And that evening, it seemed like we had an eternity together. Daniel looked at me, and I saw the same man I had once loved for his reliability, his honesty, his ability to see the most important things, his certainty that I would always be by his side. He smiled, and in that gesture lay all his love and his wish to restore the closeness we had lost. I almost felt my walls begin to crumble. He took my hand, and I felt his warmth, the same warmth that once soothed me like a safe haven. "Do you remember how we dreamed of going to Paris?" he suddenly asked, smiling with a hint of sadness. "You always said we had to see Montmartre and make a silly sketch on a canvas like the artists on the streets." I nodded, smiling in response. His words brought us back to those days when everything had seemed possible. And though we never made it to Paris, that moment reminded me that we'd had truly happy days in our life. But now, sitting across from him, I felt that those dreams had been left in the past. The entire evening we talked and laughed, but in every word, in every look, I saw not only the person who had once been dear to me, but also the distance that had grown between us. I couldn't shake the thought that everything had changed so deeply that I could no longer be the Emily I had once been for him. My soul was drawn in another direction, toward the sudden and sincere closeness I had felt with Ethan, toward a feeling of freedom I hadn't experienced in so long. As we walked home, Daniel held my hand, as if reluctant to let go, as if he sensed that a hidden crack had appeared between us. When I arranged to meet Ethan, my heart tightened with a mix of anxious anticipation and warm memories. I knew it would be a difficult conversation, and every ounce of my willpower was needed to prepare myself to be firm, to end it. The meeting was set at a cozy cafe on the other side of town, a place where no one knew us, where we could talk honestly without fear of being seen. When I entered the cafe, Ethan was already waiting by the window with a cup of coffee. His gaze was gentle yet attentive, and as always, he seemed to understand every emotion I felt, knew my thoughts even before I spoke a word. We exchanged silent smiles, and I sat across from him, feeling my breath catch from the weight of what I was about to say. For the first few minutes, we exchanged pleasantries, trading small talk as if trying to delay the inevitable. But something within me demanded clarity, and I knew that this conversation was the only way to find peace. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words, and finally began to speak. "Ethan," I started, casting my eyes down at the coffee cup in front of me. "What happened between us?" It woke me up, reminded me of what it feels like to be alive, to feel real emotions, but I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "But I can't keep going like this. It's destroying my marriage, breaking down everything Daniel and I built." Ethan listened in silence, his gaze focused, and I saw that my words struck a chord within him. He nodded slightly, as though agreeing with every word, and his expression showed a mix of sadness and acceptance. "I understand, Emily," he answered softly, without attempting to argue or persuade. "Maybe this was only meant to happen once. Maybe that night was the only moment we should have had and nothing more." A silence settled between us. Ethan had always known how to find the right words, and at this moment, it felt as though he knew I needed support, not explanations. In his eyes, I saw all the pain I felt myself. I knew he, too, was experiencing the inner conflict, the contradiction between desire and reality. "I value everything that was between us," I continued, my voice quiet. "That moment made me feel like myself. But we both know this can't go on. Otherwise, I'll destroy not only myself but also him and you." The words came with difficulty, but with each one I felt lighter, as if finally letting go of something I'd held onto for too long. We both looked at each other in silence, and in his eyes I saw understanding and the same pain I held within. Accepting that this was goodbye wasn't easy, but it was the right decision, no matter how hard it was to make. When I stood to leave, Ethan rose as well. He held my gaze for a second, and it felt as if his eyes said more than words ever could. It was a farewell without words, yet in every movement, in every look, there was a sad resolve. As a final goodbye, he leaned down and gently touched his lips to mine. The kiss was brief, but it held our entire story, all the feelings we hadn't been able to express. It was our last moment of closeness, our last chance to be open. As I left the cafe, leaving Ethan behind, I felt both lighter and heavier at the same time. I knew this kiss was a farewell, a reminder that such feelings can ignite and burn brightly, leaving only a faint trace in the heart. A few days passed, but the silence between Daniel and me had grown so deep that I could no longer bear it. The lies and constant concealment were weighing me down. Nights turned into agonizing hours of sleep that I could no longer delay the truth. An inner voice told me that after everything that had happened, there was no way for us to return to the life we'd known, no matter how painful the truth might be. That evening, I waited for Daniel to return from work and asked if we could talk. He looked a bit tense, noticing the expression on my face, but he sat down across from me, watching me carefully. "Daniel," I began, feeling my voice betray a slight tremble. "I need to confess something to you." He frowned, and in his eyes I saw a strange expectation, as if he already sensed this was something serious. I made a mistake." The words came out with difficulty, and I paused for a moment to collect myself. "I was with Ethan." Silence fell. I saw his face change, first confusion, then shock, and finally a wave of anger that seemed to burn through him. He closed his eyes as though trying to suppress the turmoil rising within, but when he opened them again, there was no trace of the warmth or care that had once been there. "You... what?" he managed, barely containing himself. "With my brother. Are you serious?" He stood abruptly, not giving me a chance to explain. His anger was so unexpected and intense that I seemed to lose my voice for a moment. I tried to say something, but my words were drowned out by his outburst. "This isn't why I wanted to reconnect with him. Not so that you'd step all over everything we've had." I could see the rage and pain tearing through him, like invisible shards piercing his heart. I had never seen him like this, restrained yet boiling inside. He clenched his fists for a moment, visibly struggling to contain himself, but it only intensified his anger. "I can't stay here," he said finally, without looking at me. "I need to see him, to hear this from him. Damn it, how could you?" Before I could respond, he grabbed his keys and headed for the door. I took a step toward him, trying to stop him, but he didn't even glance back. The door slammed shut with a deafening sound, leaving me standing alone in the silence. Now that the truth lay exposed between us, I was left to confront its weight, sinking under the burden of pain, guilt, and emptiness. After Daniel left, leaving an almost unbearable silence behind, a wave of panic washed over me. I felt that something irreversible had happened, that the invisible bridges that had once connected us were now destroyed. Every nerve in my body warned me that when he returned, things might take an even darker turn, that our arguments and conversations could spiral into something more painful. The fear gripped me, clouding my mind like fog. Daniel could be heading to Ethan in this state, and what if his anger pushed him to do something unforgivable? Desperately, I tried calling Ethan, but there was no answer. Each unanswered ring only deepened my dread, sending my thoughts into darker places. What if he couldn't control himself? What if his rage drove him to actions that would leave permanent scars? I pictured them meeting, Daniel's fury reaching its peak, and Ethan, who wasn't used to conflict, wouldn't defend himself. I couldn't risk it. Knowing I couldn't bear to stay there, I hastily packed a bag, barely aware of what I was grabbing. My head spun with tension, and barely holding back tears, I rushed out of the house, hastily zipping up my jacket and fumbling with my bag's strap. I headed toward the airport, without a clear plan, but knowing one thing. I needed to get away, to escape this chaos and find clarity. Inside, everything was burning with pain, and the only solution seemed to be running to a place where I could find some semblance of peace. I bought a ticket for the nearest flight to my parents' home, and alone with my thoughts, I felt a bit of the tension ease, allowing the tears to come. Searching for answers, I sat by the airport window, gripping my phone and hoping for a call. From Daniel, from Ethan, from anyone who could alleviate my worries. When the plane took off, I fought back the tears, but my heart felt as if it was being torn apart. Life with my parents, far from all the memories and tense conversations, felt like a brief respite, but the weight of what had happened never fully left me. Inside, there was an emptiness that couldn't be filled by conversation or daily activities. My mind was constantly pulled back to Daniel and Ethan. I felt lost, as if everything I knew about myself and my life had proved fragile and deceptive, disappearing along with the ruins of my relationship with Daniel. Several days ago, I accidentally heard from acquaintances that Ethan was in the hospital. How and why it happened was a mystery because my attempts to find any details had been in vain. Daniel's phone remained silent, and even friends I'd reached out to knew nothing about what had occurred between the brothers. They only said it was serious, that Daniel had arrived at Ethan's in fury that night, but no one could tell me more. The guilt over what had happened consumed me, igniting a fierce inner conflict. In my attempt to find myself, to seek answers, I had destroyed not only my own life, but also the bond between two people who, despite their differences, had once been close. My presence in their lives, my mistakes now weighed heavily on me. It all felt wrong, but it seemed there was no way out. Trying to fill this emptiness, I began establishing small daily routines. Waking up early, making breakfast for my parents, taking walks in the park. These simple things became my way of finding a bit of stability in a world that now felt chaotic. Every day, I made a point to take at least one step forward, moving a little further from all that had happened, inching closer to a life where I could feel whole again. But thoughts of Daniel and Ethan continued to haunt me. In them, I saw my mistakes, my choices, the passion that had blinded me, and the stability I had sacrificed. Their faces flashed before my eyes, each one stirring up a heavy sense of something I couldn't leave behind. A few months had passed since I went to my parents. In that time, the pain had dulled, but a feeling of emptiness lingered. I tried to rebuild my life step by step, overcoming guilt and regret. Yet, despite my efforts to move on, thoughts of Daniel and Ethan continued to linger, as though my mind wouldn't release them, holding on to fragments of a story that had shaped who I had become. One gray autumn day, as I was leaving a cafe downtown, I unexpectedly noticed a familiar figure walking along the sidewalk. It was Daniel. He was approaching me, looking ahead thoughtfully, and in that instant, it felt like our eyes met by pure chance, like two strangers crossing paths. I froze for a second, unsure of what to do, but Daniel didn't look away, and I realized that we both needed this conversation, no matter how unpleasant it might turn out to be. He stopped, and a heavy silence hung between us. I could see that Daniel had changed. His face looked harsher, more worn, as though he'd endured a difficult journey over these past months. In his gaze, there was no longer the warmth that had once felt like home. "Hi," I said quietly, feeling my heart clench with a mix of anxiety and regret. "Hi," he replied, his voice cold, almost indifferent. I gathered the courage to ask, "Will he be all right?" Daniel looked at me with a bitter smile, shrugging slightly before answering in a short, dismissive tone. "Yes, he'll be fine." I nodded, understanding that behind that brief answer lay much more than he was willing to say. I struggled to find the right words, but the conversation seemed to stall. My mind was flooded with thoughts, but every word I could think of felt small and inadequate. "Daniel, I'm really sorry, I began, but he cut me off sharply, his tone icy, devoid of any warmth. "I don't need your apologies, Emily," he said, his voice filled with restrained anger and scorn. "And don't worry, I'm not planning to seek revenge or teach you any lessons. You're not worth it. I just have no desire to waste my time on someone like you." His words, cold and piercing, struck harder than I had anticipated. They felt like a final sentence, the end of our story. I stood there in front of him, speechless, feeling a wave of hurt and disappointment well up inside me. His words revealed just how deeply I had wounded him, how thoroughly I had shattered everything we'd held dear. Daniel looked at me one last time with a detached expression, then turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone on the street with the bitter realization that the past could never be undone. I stood there for a long time, watching him walk away, feeling as if the last thread connecting me to my old life had finally snapped. There was no going back, no comforting illusion of repair. His words echoed in my mind, stripping away any last remnants of hope that things could be mended. Over the following days, I tried to piece myself together, immersing myself in daily routines, hoping to numb the ache. But the silence that surrounded me seemed only to deepen, as if the emptiness inside had taken on a life of its own, filling every corner of my mind with reminders of what I had lost. Life carried on around me, yet I remained haunted by the shadows of my choices. The people I saw, the streets I walked, all seemed faded, as though my past lingered in every step. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself moving through life in a sort of haze. The world continued spinning around me, but I felt as though I was watching it from behind a glass, detached and distant. I had thought that time would dull the memories, soften the edges of guilt and regret, but they clung to me, whispering reminders of the choices I'd made. At some point, I returned to work and tried to focus on rebuilding my life. I filled my days with tasks, meetings, and mundane routines, hoping they'd bring some semblance of normalcy back. Yet, even in the busyness, I'd catch myself staring off, thinking of everything that had led me here. There were moments when a memory of Daniel's warmth, Ethan's gaze, or that spark of freedom would flash before me, leaving a hollow ache behind. I knew I couldn't keep living in the past, but the future felt like uncharted territory, intimidating and uncertain. I had no clear path forward, no vision of what my life should look like now. It was as if I were caught between two worlds, the one I had lost and the one I had yet to build. Slowly, I began to accept that there would be no easy answers, no sudden relief. This was my journey now, to live with the choices I had made, to seek meaning amid the ruins of what once was, and to find a way to forgive myself, even if that felt like the hardest task of all. As time passed, I found a certain stillness in accepting my solitude. Life settled into a new rhythm, one that felt both unfamiliar and strangely peaceful. I stopped looking for distractions and let myself truly feel the weight of my choices. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the emptiness seemed unbearable. But gradually, I learned to live with it, to make space for it. One evening, while sorting through some old things, I stumbled upon the portrait Ethan and I had done that day in New Orleans. Holding it in my hands, I felt a mixture of emotions, a bittersweet nostalgia and a gentle sadness. The memories were there, vivid and warm, but now they felt like a chapter I could close, rather than a wound I had to carry. I had changed. There was no denying that. The person who had yearned for something beyond her marriage, who had crossed boundaries she thought she'd never cross, was gone. In her place was someone quieter, someone who understood the gravity of her actions and the consequences they had brought. Looking at that portrait, I realized that my past would always be a part of me, woven into who I had become. But now, instead of running from it, I could face it and carry it with a sense of acceptance. My journey wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the scars and finding strength in them. As I placed the portrait back, I felt a small but real glimmer of hope. Maybe one day, I would find the courage to love again, to trust again, even if only in myself. Until then, I would continue forward step by step, embracing the person I was becoming in the quiet spaces of this new life. Over time, that glimmer of hope grew, small but steady, like a faint light at the end of a long tunnel. I found myself looking toward the future with less fear, realizing that while I couldn't change my past, I could reshape what lay ahead. The days grew lighter, and I no longer felt haunted by every memory. Instead, they became lessons, reminders of the complexity of love, desire, and the need to feel truly alive. I began reconnecting with old friends, slowly stepping back into the world I had withdrawn from. Each encounter, each laugh shared over coffee or walk in the park, reminded me that life was still full of beauty, still open to second chances. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden epiphany. But as weeks turned into months, I found peace in the simplest moments, in the quiet understanding that I was free to rebuild, to redefine myself. And so I continued forward, not as the person I once was, nor entirely as someone new, but as a blend of the two. A person who had faced her darkest parts and emerged with a deeper understanding of what it meant to love, to lose, and finally, to heal.